Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share some stories involving unidentified cryptids, and I must say that these stories are possibly some of the creepiest yet fascinating stories I've come across. They include a creature showing up to make a hunting trip go bad, a very bizarre encounter in Arizona, a creature stalking someone on a farm in Portugal, and a series of encounters in Texas that has a girl fearing for her life. But first, we start with a story from Iowa where a young man and his mother have both encountered something they cannot explain. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Iowa, where the original poster, or OP, believes he and his mother saw a creature that was either a skinwalker or Wendigo. But as we get into this story, I think it may be something else entirely. The OP does not say where in Iowa his story takes place, just that he lived in a neighborhood consisting of at least 25 homes that is completely surrounded by a forest. He says he has spent a lot of time watching horror movies, with most of them taking place in a forest, so he was already on alert when he was outside. The first sighting of the creature the OP and his mother believed to be in the forest where they live happened a few years into them living in Iowa. He was staying with his mother at the time and mentions that she is full Native American, as is her side of the family. He isn't sure what tribe, but they are fully aware of the lore involving skinwalkers and Wendigo, and fully believe it to be true. One day when he was staying with his mother, she was in her car on her way home, driving on a road that was lined by forest on each side. There were also 2 farms and a couple of houses in the area. As she drove up a hill near their neighborhood, she came to a field where she saw a creature walking into the forest. She described what she saw as having gray skin, being tall, and having hooves for feet. Confused by what she saw, she checked the rearview mirror when she reached a stop sign but saw nothing. She became frightened and took off for home, fully believing she had just seen a Wendigo. She told the OP what happened when she got home, which sent a jolt of fear through him as he recalled the stories he heard on YouTube, especially those involving skinwalkers. From that point on, he was cautious and remained on alert while riding his bike outside. But one day he rode his bike near the hill where his mother saw the creature. His reason for going to the area was to take pictures of the landscape. However, he felt extremely paranoid the entire time he was near the field where his mother saw this thing. Trusting his gut, he jumped back on his bike and left the area, feeling as though he was being watched the entire time, especially while riding past the field. A few days after his weird experience at the field, it was night and his dog needed to be let out. So he let his dog out and put it on a leash that was attached to the porch. He turned the outside light on to keep an eye on his dog like he normally did, but he also had food cooking in the kitchen. He went to the kitchen to check on his food when he heard his dog start barking. Being that it was late, he didn't want his dog to wake the neighbors, so he hurried back out to see that his dog was barking at something in the darkness beyond the porch's light. He opened the door and told his dog to be quiet, but he just kept barking at something in the darkness. He then tried to get him to come inside, but he just kept barking. The OP got a bad feeling as paranoia came over him, and he looked into the darkness to see eyeshine within the trees, reflected by the porch's light. He finally reached down and grabbed the leash, pulling on it while yelling at his dog to get inside. When his dog was safely inside, the OP slammed and locked the door before going around and making sure all the windows and doors were locked and covered so no one or nothing could see inside. 2 months after he saw those eyes shining in the darkness, and at the time of his posting, he continued his routine each night, making sure all the doors and windows were locked and covered. When he did go outside, he felt like he needed to be with a group of people or have a weapon with him. I don't think eyeshine is something any of us would want to see while looking into the darkness around our home at night. I'm just glad he was able to get his dog back inside and there was no further incident. As for what this is, I don't think it was a skinwalker because the mother who saw the creature was able to describe what she saw as a wendigo. However, in the Algonquin lore and legend, wendigo are not said to have hooved feet. There is a creature, though, that is usually described as having hooved feet and is often misidentified as a wendigo. That creature is known as a witchuge. She doesn't give a description of the head, but perhaps she didn't see it. But given the fact that she described the feet as being hooved and her thinking it was a wendigo makes me think there's a witchuge hanging around the OP's neighborhood. For those who may not know, the witchuge is the creature seen in many descriptions of what people think a wendigo looks like. It is anywhere from 15 to 20 feet tall, sometimes taller, has a skull-like head and antlers. It is also usually depicted as having hooved feet. In any case, I don't blame the OP for covering the windows at night and being on high alert when outside, especially when he is in the forest. Hopefully he and his mother have seen the last of this creature. What do you think it was? Skinwalker, wendigo, witchuge, or something else? The next story comes from Pennsylvania, where a young man had 2 encounters with a being while on a hunting trip. But let me just say that this story involves mimicry and is one of the creepiest stories I've heard involving this technique due to what each person hears. And we also have another story where encounters are accompanied by weird dreams. The original poster posted his story with other skinwalker stories because he believes this is what he encountered out there 2 days in a row. He does not say where exactly his story takes place, just that it happened at his family's hunting cabin in December of 2020. The planned trip was supposed to be 2 weeks long, with the OP, his father, grandfather, and his brother arriving just before 5 on the first day. They still had some daylight left, so they decided to head out into the woods to see if they could get some hunting done on that first day. So the OP, his brother, and their father set out into the forest and quickly found some tracks in the lightly snow-covered ground from the snow that had fallen earlier in the day. They walked for about 5 minutes until they found 2 sets of tracks and some scat they recognized as belonging to a buck. They split up then, with the OP following one set of tracks and his brother and father following the second. The OP walked on a ways until the forest started becoming unpassable and he could not see more than 30 yards in front of him. So he sat down and leaned against a tree with his rifle. Approximately 15 minutes passed with the OP sitting there having a snack and drinking some water when the entire forest around him went silent. There was no noise whatsoever, and the OP describes the experience as being like he suddenly went deaf. Then he heard loud crunches and pops of sticks and leaves under footsteps that were way too heavy to be a deer and couldn't have been a bear because they didn't see many out during the winter. The OP was then hit with an awful smell he describes as smelling like meat that had been left outside to rot in the sun for weeks. This is when he knew something wasn't right. He remained in that same spot for about 5 more minutes before the feeling that he was being watched came over him. He says he isn't one to get scared easily, but this sensation was enough to make him pack up his things, grab his gun, and head back to the cabin, looking behind him every few yards. He got back to the cabin right around 6 o'clock, and it was dark out. His father, grandfather, and brother were sitting around a campfire eating hot dogs and beans. The OP pulled up a chair and joined them, grabbing a hot dog. His father asked him if he saw anything, but instead of telling them what happened, he just said he saw nothing besides snow and birds. He didn't think it would be a good idea to tell them what he smelled and heard. Later that night, while he was lying in bed, he texted a family friend who was around 50 years old at the time of his post and told him he had a weird experience in the woods. When the family friend asked him what happened, the OP told him he smelled something terrible out there and heard very heavy footsteps. The family friend asked him what kind of smell, and the OP replied and told him that it was of rotting meat. The family friend then said he was afraid he'd say that and told him a story about what happened to him back in 1999 when he was hunting. He had been sitting in the woods when a smell came over him that smelled like rotting flesh before everything went silent. He didn't see anything, but 15 minutes after the forest went still, he heard his mother's voice call for him to come here. He heard the voice clear as day, and there was no question in his mind it was her voice. The only problem with that was his mother had passed away 2 years prior to his experience. He ran out of those woods, never looked back, and didn't go hunting again. When the OP read this, he dropped his phone out of pure shock and pulled the blankets up over himself and went to bed. That night he had a terrible dream that he was being chased by a deer that wasn't really a deer. Right before it attacked him, he woke up sweating and screaming. His story picks up the next day when he was out hunting. He had taken up a position in a tree stand they installed during the summer and was there for about an hour when everything went quiet. He once again heard approaching footsteps and was overcome by that same smell from the previous day. However, this time he did see the creature. He describes it as something that looked like a deer but had ragged skin hanging off of it, no tail, and the skin on its face was drooped down way farther than it should have been. Shaking like he never had before, he raised his gun and fired at this creature twice before it ran off with inhuman speed, screaming and crying like crazy, as the OP puts it. His father radioed him about 5 minutes later and asked if he got something. That's when the OP told him he shot at something that looked like a deer and to just please get to his position before dropping his radio. 15 minutes later, his father, grandfather, and brother showed up and had to help him down from the tree stand. He told him what he shot at and that it looked like a doe, but it was just different somehow. He described the creature to them, but they didn't believe him. He says he didn't blame them for that, and it almost sounded too crazy for him to believe himself. But then something happened that made them all believe. Something called out to them saying, "Where are you?" But the weirdest and creepiest part of them hearing this voice was that they all heard it in their own mother's voice. The OP's grandfather heard his mother's voice, his father heard his mother's, and the OP and his brother heard theirs. The same thing said to them at the same moment, but all of them hearing it in a different voice. This was followed by a baby crying somewhere in the woods. The OP says they felt kind of bad leaving with the crying baby sound, but they knew it wasn't real and they got out of there. When they reached the cabin, they began packing up their belongings when they heard a thud on the front door. The OP opened it with his rifle in hand and found 2 dead rabbits lying on the porch. Both of them had their stomachs ripped out. They quickly packed the truck and drove out of there, driving as fast as they could. The OP describes it as the longest ride of his life. Not long after, they sold the property and none of them would go back. The new owners had the cabin for about a year when they started having weird things happen. The OP ends his post by asking if they should tell the new owners what happened to them out there. There's just something about this story that really creeps me out. The dream, the voices, the dead rabbits thrown at the front door. Seems like something in that forest did not like the OP and his family being out there. And it doesn't seem to have stopped with them. I've always said it's such a shame when these creatures rob us of something we love. It usually involves going out into the wilderness to camp or to hunt like the OP in this story. And for it to be with his family too, and it sounding like a yearly trip makes it that much more of a shame. Hopefully they can find somewhere else to go to spend some time together, like perhaps a bright sunny beach somewhere. I know he says he thinks it's a skinwalker, but I'm not so sure. It's strange how he described what he shot at as looking like a deer with the skin hanging off of it. The speed he says it ran off with, though, definitely makes me think it's a cryptid, especially with the smell, the forest going quiet, and the heavy footsteps. Then there is the voice they all heard. But what was really unsettling about this story for me was that they all heard whatever was calling them to come in a different voice. The voices of their mothers. I'll admit this is a new one for me. I haven't heard of this happening before, and I find it very fascinating. As for what I think this could be, I kind of want to say Wachuge, given that the description of the creature was that of a deer. I was thinking perhaps a Wendigo until he said it looked like a deer. This is definitely a bizarre encounter. I'm glad everyone was able to get out of there safely. What do you think this was? The next story comes from a poster who believes they encountered a skinwalker in Arizona, an area of the United States where skinwalker sightings are commonplace, as it is in very close proximity to Navajo Nation. He was not in Navajo Nation at the time of his sighting and encounter, but does say that he drove through several reservations at the time. Most of them, he says, were Navajo reservations. He was in Arizona with some friends, heading to one of his friends' home in southern Arizona. His friend told the group that if they saw someone standing on the side of the road, they shouldn't pay any attention to them and definitely shouldn't make eye contact with them. Well, a couple of hours into the drive through Arizona, the OP and his friend who was driving were the only ones awake in the car, when they came across a man standing on the side of the road dressed in tan leather from head to toe, wearing a large wide-brimmed hat. Instead of heeding his friend's warning and not paying the man any attention, the OP looked directly at him. From that point on, every couple of miles he would see the man, dressed in all tan leather, standing on the side of the road looking at him. He would catch quick glimpses of his face every now and then, but the man didn't seem to have one. Fear settled in, and the OP decided to just close his eyes until they got to his friend's town. He didn't see the man or anything else for the rest of the trip. However, this wouldn't be his only trip to the area, as they head out there every year. The most recent trip to the area before he made his post, he and his friends had gone to his friend's family's cabin that they owned up in the mountains. Their car got stuck in the snow and they had to call a towing company to send someone to get them out of their current predicament. The OP talked at length with the man sent by the company, and he distinctly remembers him being Native American, having long black hair, and wearing a tan suit, which even included an animal skin on his shoulders. He was not wearing a hat though. The man was very friendly and kept saying he wanted to eat dinner with the OP and his friends. They declined because they didn't have enough food, but the man said he would get some more and bring it back. But again, they told him no. Not long before posting, he and his friends were talking about that day, and his friends didn't see a Native American man sent by the towing company. They all swore up and down that the man had short blonde hair, a southern accent, was wearing snow gear, and never once asked to eat with them. The OP's friend asked him if he had seen anything unusual elsewhere, so the OP told him about the man he saw on the side of the road during their previous trip. His friend told him he had seen a skinwalker and it was following him. Being that the OP lived on the East Coast, his friend believed the skinwalker only came looking for him when he was in Arizona or the surrounding area. Since this second encounter, the OP now has constant dreams about going back to Arizona. He ends his post saying no one believes him except for his one friend and asks whoever reads his account for their opinions about what is happening to him. At the time of his post, he and his friends had a trip to Arizona planned that he was nervous about. His story was posted a year ago and there haven't been any updates. He does, however, continue to post, so he looks to be doing alright, and it would seem his most recent trip to Arizona was uneventful. This would be such a bizarre and creepy occurrence, to see a man standing on the side of the road only to continue seeing him at certain intervals during the rest of the drive, and then to see a completely different person than that of his friends. I'll be honest here, I think I remember a story where I heard something like this happening once, but it was nothing like this, where he stood talking to this person for a long time only to find out his friends saw someone completely different. And then to have that man insist on coming to eat dinner with them that evening? If his friend is right and this is a skinwalker, then it has definitely chosen him as its prey and looks like it will stop at nothing to get him. But with no further post by the OP, it would seem like this supposed skinwalker either lost interest or moved on. I have heard though, and there is one commenter on this post who says that once a skinwalker picks a target, they will stop at nothing until they get them. There were also others in the comments who suggested the OP consult someone to see what they could do to ward this skinwalker off. He seemed to be leaning in that direction, so let's hope that's what he did, and he was able to ward off this skinwalker. What do you think about this one? Have you ever heard of this happening? Where one person sees a completely different person than everyone else around them? The next story comes from Portugal, where the original poster had two weird experiences he cannot explain he believes could have been a skinwalker. Given that he lives in Portugal, there is very little chance of it being a skinwalker, but that doesn't mean he didn't encounter something around his home. He describes where he lives as very rural, with some farms and other homes in the area. The way he describes it makes it sound like these other homes are close but not too close. However, from atop the wall around his home, he can see his neighbor's homes. The area is heavily forested, which completely encompasses the farm where he lives. His first encounter happened when he had two friends over for dinner. They were eating outside and everything was fine until they began hearing a woman scream. He says it was very odd as there is very little crime where he lives and no animal attacks. The forest where he lives contains a variety of birds, but nothing like mountain lions, bobcats, or bears. Hunters have wiped out most of the animals there, according to the OP. On high alert by this point, he was the first to react and climb the wall that separates his home from the part of the farm that contained the animals. From this vantage point, he could see his neighbors' homes. His friends climbed up beside him on the wall, where they wait to see if they heard any more screams. Sure enough, they heard the scream again, but couldn't understand what it was saying. Then they heard it a third time, the same woman's voice yelling for help. This was followed by the voice speaking a bunch of gibberish. One of his friends called the police, being that their first thought was domestic violence or a robbery. The OP jumped down from the wall, retrieved his axe, and walked up to his gate. His friend followed, but they stopped inside the wall, not leaving the grounds, being that something just wasn't right about the screams. The OP says they sounded odd. Therefore, they had no idea what awaited them should they go through the gate. So they remained where they were and waited for the police. Before the police arrived, they heard a thud followed by the breaking of glass they assumed was a window. However, when the police arrived, they found nothing. The screaming had stopped and seemed to vanish. Later that night, the OP and his friends were talking about what happened that day when one of his friends told them he had heard those same screams, the same woman's voice, before while walking his dog. The next day, they decided to venture into the forest where they thought they heard the screams come from, expecting to find a house. But when they arrived at the place they thought a house would be, there was nothing, only forest. They went back to the OP's house and decided to forget about what happened. The OP mentions here that no one thought to connect what happened to a skinwalker, including himself, but then he had his second encounter and that's when he believed it could be one. One night, his cousins had come over to visit and for dinner. They decided to take a walk in his garden, which was separated from the forest by only a small stone wall. As he and his one cousin walked and talked, having a good time, they began hearing a man's voice speaking gibberish just like the woman's voice from his first encounter. He says the voice was not normal and sounded like something was in the man's throat, like it had an odd frequency to it. The OP went and got his axe while his cousin called his sister to come out to the garden. They went to the wall and heard the voice continuously speaking gibberish without a break and not even taking a breath. After listening for a while, they decided there was nothing they could do but go finish their dinner. Once the OP's cousin left, he began feeling a bit unsettled and remembered all the nights his dog would bark at the forest. He found this odd, being that all the animals had been wiped out by hunters. This made him remember the warnings his parents would give him when he was a child, telling him to be out of the forest and have all the doors locked by sunset. He would ask them why, but they would never tell him. He always found it odd, being that they lived in a calm little location in a calm country. He could not understand what they were so worried about. Everything came to an end when lumberjacks came and leveled the forest. After that, he didn't have any more weird experiences and his dog stopped barking at the forest. I don't think this is a skinwalker, but then that poses the question of, what is it? One commenter thinks it could be a crawler. Whatever the case is, I'm a bit stumped by this one. It would seem his parents knew something was out there given that they told him to be inside by nightfall as a child. Whatever it was, maybe it's a good thing that lumberjacks came and leveled the forest to force this thing to move on. It seemed to have taken an interest in the OP. But luckily, just like with wild animals, you take away something's habitat, it is forced to find a new one. Hopefully, it hasn't picked a new target. What do you think this thing was? The final story of this episode comes from Texas and involves a girl who keeps seeing and hearing a creature she believes is following her. It has gotten to the point that she fears for her life when she is outside at night. She posted her encounters online in hopes of getting some advice on why this could be happening to her and how she can stop it. She does not say where exactly her story takes place. The first encounter the OP details took place in spring of 2021, when she and her friend were hiking on a trail that was 10 or so minutes from her house. They had walked about half a mile down the trail when they started hearing a woman screaming, and it sounded like she was in mortal danger. She was screaming and pleading for someone to come and help her. The girls yelled back if they should call someone, but the voice didn't answer. It just kept screaming the same things over and over. The girls' first thought was to leave the woods and call the police, but instead they decided to go get a better look to see if they could help this woman who was clearly in trouble. So they picked up some rocks and started down the trail toward where they heard the screams. But then they heard a male voice scream at the woman to shut up or he would kill her. Then the voices fell silent. It was then that the girls decided to call the police. They started with the non-emergency line, who told them to call 911. The dispatcher then told them to wait by the trail's entrance for an officer to arrive, which is exactly what they did. About 10 minutes later, an officer showed up and, according to the OP, was very suspicious of two 15-year-old girls calling in a possible homicide. She says the officer searched the trail for about 20 minutes but found nothing. The officers got their names and said they'd call them if anything came up, but they never did. When the OP got home, she told her sister what happened, and she told the OP it might have been a skinwalker trying to lure them into the woods by mimicking someone needing help. Their father had told them about the skinwalker legends before. The OP told her that sounded crazy, but what her sister said stuck with her. Her next encounter would take place just a few nights after the first, while she was out at night walking her family's dogs with her sister. During their walk, her sister looked over at something and chuckled. When the OP asked her what she was laughing at, her sister asked why a trash can was sitting in the middle of the road. The OP looked past their community's gate and saw what her sister was talking about, but it was not a trash can. It was a white creature with skinny legs and arms and hands that looked like claws. It started moving toward them, but looked very strange and unnatural in its movements. The OP says it didn't look human, but it wasn't animalistic either. She says she has never run so fast in her entire life, and when they got home they told their mother what happened, but she looked at them like they were crazy. However, when they told their father, a worried look came over his face and he told them about something he experienced while camping. The creature he saw then was eerily similar to what his daughters saw that night. They did not walk their dogs at night for a while after the incident. Eventually, enough time passed that everything went back to normal and the OP says she felt safe. Her third encounter would happen in January of 2022 after she made some new friends and was hanging out with them one night. One of her friends had a place they referred to as a hideout in the woods that they wanted to show the rest of the group. Everyone agreed, so they set out into the forest at night, a decision the OP says wasn't the smartest given what she had been through to that point. But she was in a good neighborhood and once again felt safe, so off they went. But as they were walking through the woods, they heard someone scream for help. This time it was a man's voice. The OP knew better than to investigate, so she snapped at the group to run for the car. When they reached the car, she told them about skinwalkers and her previous encounters. They of course looked at her like she was crazy until she pulled up a video and showed it to them. The video sounded exactly like what they had just heard. The OP avoided nighttime trips to the woods for a while after that, but eventually the incident with her friends faded from memory and she went back into the woods at night. Her next experience with this creature happened a little more than a month before she posted her stories online. She thought her encounters with the being, whatever it was, were over and done. But unfortunately for her, she was wrong. She had once again ventured into the woods at night with one of her friends who was with her during her last encounter. They were walking along when the OP dropped her phone and they stopped to look for it. And they once again heard screaming coming from the darkness around them. This time it was the voice of a little boy yelling for help. The OP couldn't quite make out everything the boy was saying, but had heard enough, so she and her friend got out of there as quickly as they could. After this, she had yet another encounter, with this one happening a few weeks before posting online to tell her story and seek advice. The OP and her sister were once again walking their dog when they heard incoherent screaming. They yelled back, offering help to whoever was in need, but whoever it was, or whatever it was, just kept screaming incoherently. Once again knowing what was up and what they needed to do, the girls went straight back home. The last and most recent encounter documented by the OP took place just 2 nights before she posted her story, when she and her friends were walking around a ditch by one of their homes. They had just been there the night before and didn't think it would be dangerous. But the night would take a scary turn as they saw something when they were about half a mile away from their car. One of her friends at first thought it was just a sign, but then it moved. They could only see a black silhouette due to how dark it was where this creature was standing, but the OP says it looked like it either had horns or its arms raised over its head. The group took off for the car when this thing started moving toward them. The OP hasn't been outside past dark since this latest encounter. She hasn't told anyone about her most recent encounter because she is afraid of the backlash for once again going outside at night. She ends her post saying she had to tell someone and it lessens the burden getting it off her chest by posting it online. She also says that she genuinely fears for her life. If I had any advice for the OP, it would be to please stop going outside after dark. Joking aside, it does seem like this thing has taken an interest in her, as the screamings and sightings of this creature seem to revolve around her. The first time they heard the woman screaming, she and her friends should have just ignored it and left the area. Now, I'm not saying it's their fault. They didn't know any better at the time, and these mimics can replicate voices exactly. There's no way they could have known. But she did start ignoring the screams after that first encounter, which is good, and immediately leaves when she hears them. I'm thinking if she continues to stay inside at night, maybe this thing will eventually lose interest and move on. However, if she does go out during the day, especially into the woods, I wouldn't go alone. As for what this thing is, a few things come to mind: skinwalker, crawler, or goatman. If they live in a part of Texas near New Mexico, then it isn't out of the realm of possibilities that a skinwalker could be there. When she saw the creature though, she said it looked like it had horns. My immediate thought when I read this was goatman, which has been spotted in Texas numerous times. Then there are the similarities to a crawler in these stories. However, after reading this story once again for this recording, I think it could be a goatman. In any case, all 3 cryptids are said to be able to mimic screams and voices perfectly, trying to lure people into the forest or deeper into the forest. What do you think she keeps seeing and hearing? And what should she do to get this thing to leave her alone? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.